The gold-plated Mont Blanc pen hovered 3 inches above the contract, its shadow trembling against the cream-colored paper like a spider preparing to strike. Maya Chen steadied her hands around the coffee pot, steam curling between her fingers as she watched the man in the navy Armani suit lean forward, his breath fogging the glass table at Meridian's most exclusive private dining room. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Just your signature here, Mr. Blackwood, and the $300 million will transfer by close of business today, the lawyer said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses with the precision of a surgeon. The document lay spread across the mahogany table like a feast of legal jargon, each page thick with the weight of generational wealth about to change hands. Maya had been refilling water glasses in this room for 3 years, invisible as the marble statues that lined the restaurant's corridors. She knew the rhythm of power lunches, the cadence of deals that moved mountains and toppled governments. But something felt different today. The air crackled with an electricity that made her skin prickle, the same sensation she'd felt as a child in her grandmother's house in Chinatown, moments before the old woman would announce that spirits were restless. The elderly Mr. Blackwood, Theodore Blackwood III, according to the reservation book, sat ramrod straight despite his 87 years, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His weathered hands, marked with liver spots and the faint blue of prominent veins, trembled slightly as they approached the pen. Maya noticed how his right hand favored his left, a subtle compensatory movement she recognized from watching her own grandfather struggle with arthritis in his final years. "This represents 4 generations of our family's work," Theodore whispered, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "The Blackwood Foundation has been my father's dream, my dream. And now—" He paused, his pale blue eyes growing distant. "Now it will be Marcus's legacy to carry forward." Marcus Blackwood sat across from his grandfather, younger by 60 years, but somehow carrying an older soul in his dark eyes. Maya had served him before, always polite, always tipping exactly 20%, never making eye contact for longer than necessary. Today he wore grief like an ill-fitting jacket, his movements too careful, too measured. The lawyer, someone Maya had never seen before, with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, shuffled through additional documents. The foundation's assets, including the pharmaceutical patents, the real estate holdings in Manhattan and the Hamptons, and of course the art collection, will all transfer seamlessly. Your grandson has been preparing for this responsibility for years. Maya moved around the table's perimeter, her soft-soled shoes silent against the Persian rug. She had memorized every thread of that rug during countless lunch services, knew which corner had the barely visible wine stain from a celebration 2 summers ago, which edge had been worn thin by the chair legs of men who moved billions with their signatures. As she reached for Theodore's water glass, something caught her eye. The signature line on the contract bore a name she'd seen before, written in the same elegant script that had signed her personal recommendation letter when she had applied for the position at Meridian. Theodore Blackwood III. But not as he wrote it now. Her breath caught in her throat. 3 years of serving Theodore's monthly luncheons had burned his signature into her memory. She'd seen it on birthday cards to staff, on Christmas bonuses, on the leather-bound guest book he always carried. His handwriting had evolved over the years, growing shakier with age, but maintaining its distinctive characteristics. The way his T curved backward like a question mark, the loop of his B that never quite closed, and the underline beneath Blackwood that always curved upward at the end like a smile. This signature on this contract was wrong. Every letter, every curve, every confident stroke that spoke of a steady hand far younger than Theodore's trembling fingers could produce. Maya's grandmother had taught her that silence was golden, but truth was platinum. The old woman had survived the Cultural Revolution by knowing when to speak and when to observe, when to trust her eyes over her fears. Now, as Maya stared at the forged signature, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "When you see a lie wearing the clothes of truth, child, that is when your voice must be strongest." The room seemed to contract around her. Theodore lifted the pen, his hand wavering slightly as muscle memory battled arthritis. The lawyer leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the old man's movements with the intensity of a hawk watching prey. Marcus shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that Maya could see the pulse in his temple. Something was terribly, devastatingly wrong. The fountain pen, a gift from Theodore's late wife, according to stories Maya had overheard, pressed against the paper. The old man's signature began to form, each letter a struggle against time and disease. But Maya saw what the others couldn't. This signature matched the forged one already on the document. Someone had practiced. Someone had learned to replicate Theodore's deteriorating handwriting so perfectly that even he wouldn't notice the difference. The weight of $300 million pressed against Maya's chest like a physical force. Somewhere in this room sat a predator who had spent months, maybe years, preparing for this moment. Someone who knew Theodore's habits, his mannerisms, his family dynamics intimately enough to orchestrate this elaborate deception. Maya's hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot. The decision crystallized in her mind like ice forming on a winter lake. Inevitable, necessary, and impossible to reverse once begun. Her grandmother's voice whispered again, "The universe puts you exactly where you need to be, exactly when you need to be there. Trust that placement, child. Trust your eyes. Trust your voice." The lawyer's phone buzzed against the table. "Excuse me," he said, glancing at the screen. "The bank is confirming the transfer details. Everything should be finalized within the hour." Theodore nodded, his pen hovering over the final signature line. "It feels strange to sign away a lifetime's work in a single afternoon, but Marcus has proven himself ready. Haven't you, grandson?" Marcus met his grandfather's eyes, and Maya saw something flicker there. Pain, guilt, or perhaps resignation. "I hope I can honor everything you've built, Grandpa." The pen descended toward the paper. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. In 30 seconds, maybe less, $300 million would disappear into accounts that she suspected belonged to anyone but the Blackwood Foundation. The art collection, including pieces by Monet and Picasso, would vanish into private hands. The pharmaceutical patents that funded research into Alzheimer's disease would cease their work. The Manhattan properties that housed low-income families would be sold to developers who saw only profit margins. Maya grew up poor. Her family's restaurant in Chinatown had survived on margins thinner than rice paper. Every dollar counted twice. Every expense weighed against necessity. She understood the weight of money, the difference between having it and losing it, the way poverty could hollow out a family from the inside like termites in an old house. But she also understood something else, the responsibility that came with witnessing evil and choosing silence over action.
The pen touched paper. Theodore's signature began to flow, each letter formed with the careful concentration of a man whose hands no longer obeyed his mind's commands. Maya watched the ink spread across the page, watched $300 million begin its journey into the wrong hands. And then she found her voice. "That signature is forged." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Theodore's pen stopped mid-letter. The lawyer's head snapped toward Maya with the speed of a startled predator. Marcus's face went white as fresh snow. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the foundation beneath their feet. Maya's voice, usually soft as whispered prayers, had cut through the room's expensive tranquility like a blade through silk. She stood frozen beside the coffee service, every muscle in her body screaming at her to run, to apologize, to pretend she'd never spoken. But her grandmother's ghost stood beside her, and $300 million hung in the balance, and somewhere in this room sat a person who had betrayed not just money, but trust.
Theodore's pale blue eyes found Maya's dark ones across the table. "I beg your pardon, dear." The lawyer laughed, a sound like ice cracking under pressure. "I think perhaps the young lady misunderstood something she overheard. These are complex financial matters." But Maya had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Her voice grew stronger, fueled by 3 years of invisibility, by a lifetime of watching the powerful prey upon the vulnerable, by the memory of her grandmother's courage in the face of impossible odds. "The signature on that contract," she said, pointing with a steady finger at the document. "It's not yours, Mr. Blackwood. I've seen you sign documents before. Your T curves backward, your B never closes completely, and you always underline your surname with an upward curve. That signature belongs to someone else." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Theodore set down his pen with the deliberate care of a man defusing a bomb. The lawyer's professional smile had frozen into something resembling a death mask. Marcus stared at Maya as if she had materialized from thin air. Maya Chen had learned the art of invisibility from her mother, who had perfected it during her own years as a hotel housekeeper in downtown San Francisco. "Move like water," her mother had taught her. "See everything, hear everything, remember everything, but never let them know you're there. That's how we survive in their world." For 3 years, Maya had been the perfect invisible woman at Meridian, the kind of fine dining establishment where senators met with foreign ambassadors, where tech billionaires shook hands over deals that would reshape entire industries, where old money and new power converged over plates that cost more than Maya's monthly rent. She had memorized the preferences of men who controlled countries and women who owned media empires. She knew who cheated on their spouses, who had gambling problems, who snorted cocaine in the restaurant's marble bathrooms between courses. But Maya had never intended to remain invisible forever. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., she would awake in her studio apartment above her aunt's dim sum restaurant in Chinatown, the scent of steamed pork buns and jasmine tea seeping through the thin floorboards. The apartment was smaller than some people's closets, a Murphy bed, a kitchenette with 2 burners, a bathroom so tiny that she could wash her hands while sitting on the toilet. But it was hers, paid for with tips from serving people who dropped more money on a single bottle of wine than she made in a month. The walk to Meridian took 47 minutes on foot, winding through neighborhoods that transformed with each block like layers of sediment in an archaeological dig. From Chinatown's narrow alleys where elderly men played shengshi in Portsmouth Square, through the financial district's canyon of glass and steel, finally arriving at the restaurant's discreet entrance on a tree-lined street where parking meters cost more per hour than minimum wage. Maya had stumbled into fine dining by accident, the way most essential discoveries happen, through necessity dressed as coincidence. 3 years ago, desperate for work that paid better than the sweatshop where she'd been hemming designer clothes for 12 hours a day, she'd answered a Craigslist ad for a service professional at an upscale establishment. She'd expected a hotel or maybe a boutique.
Instead, she had found herself in Meridian's gleaming kitchen, surrounded by chefs who spoke in languages she didn't recognize, about techniques she'd never heard of. The interview had lasted 12 minutes. The general manager, a severe woman named Patricia Westbrook, who wore her gray hair like a crown and her authority like armor, had looked Maya up and down with the clinical assessment of a horse trader. "Can you carry a conversation in 3 languages?" Patricia had asked. "English, Mandarin, and Cantonese. Can you remember complex orders without writing them down?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you remain professionally invisible while personally attentive?" Maya had nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what the question meant.
"The clientele here values discretion above all else," Patricia had continued. "They pay for the privilege of conducting sensitive business without worrying about gossip or indiscretion. You will see things, hear things that never happened. Do you understand?" At the time, Maya had thought Patricia was talking about celebrity sightings or minor indiscretions. She hadn't understood that she was being recruited into a kind of professional amnesia, a career built on forgetting other people's secrets. But Maya had always possessed an inconvenient memory for detail. As a child, she could recall entire conversations weeks after they had occurred, could describe the exact placement of objects in rooms she'd visited once. Her grandmother had called it a gift. Her teachers had called it unusual. Her employers at Meridian had called it perfect for their needs. Until today. The aftermath of her accusation had unfolded like a controlled demolition. Theodore had demanded to see the signature she'd referenced. The lawyer had attempted to minimize her concerns. Marcus had sat in frozen silence, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine landing on different combinations of guilt and fear. But Patricia Westbrook had appeared in the private dining room as if summoned by some invisible alarm, her presence filling the space like smoke from a fire. She'd taken one look at the scene, the interrupted contract signing, the obvious tension, Maya standing beside the coffee service with her hand still extended toward the forged document, and had made a decision that would haunt Maya for weeks to come. "Miss Chen, please step outside with me." The conversation in the hallway had been brief and devastating. Patricia's voice had carried the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, professionally neutral and absolutely final. "I don't know what you think you saw in there, but your employment at Meridian is terminated effective immediately. You'll receive your final paycheck by mail. Please collect your personal belongings and leave the premises." "But the signature really is—" "Miss Chen, I strongly advise you to consider the consequences of making unfounded accusations against our valued guests. Mr. Blackwood and his family have been dining here for 15 years. They deserve better than to have their private business disrupted by speculation from staff members who have overstepped their boundaries." Maya had wanted to argue, to explain what she'd seen, to insist that someone investigate before it was too late. But Patricia's expression had made clear that the conversation was over. Security had escorted Maya to the employee locker room, watched her pack her few belongings into a paper bag, and walked her to the street exit. The March afternoon air had hit her like a slap. In the space of 30 minutes, she'd lost her job, her income, and potentially her reputation in an industry where word traveled faster than gossip in a small town. Worse, she'd left behind a room where a crime was about to be completed, where an elderly man was about to lose everything he'd worked for because she hadn't been persuasive enough, hadn't been important enough, hadn't been believable enough to stop it. That evening, Maya had sat in her tiny apartment, staring at her laptop screen and wondering if she was losing her mind. Had she really seen what she thought she'd seen? Had her years of observing the powerful and wealthy finally driven her to paranoid fantasies? Maybe the lawyer was right. Maybe these were complex financial matters that someone with her background couldn't properly understand. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Theodore's signature forming on that paper, the practiced loops and curves that matched the forged version already on the contract. Someone had studied his handwriting for months, maybe years. Someone had known he would sign those documents today, in that room, without the presence of his usual legal counsel. Maya had grown up in a world where questioning authority was dangerous, where people like her family kept their heads down and their mouths shut because survival depended on invisibility. Her parents had immigrated from China with nothing but determination and a willingness to work jobs that others wouldn't take. They'd built their small restaurant through 16-hour days and 7-day weeks, never complaining, never drawing attention to themselves. But they'd also taught Maya something else, that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of corruption. Her grandmother, who had lived through wars and revolutions and famines, had survived by knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. She'd also known that some moments demanded courage over safety, truth over comfort. Maya spent 3 sleepless nights researching everything she could find about the Blackwood Foundation, about Theodore's family history, about the legal requirements for transferring such massive assets. What she discovered made her stomach turn with a mixture of vindication and horror. The Blackwood Foundation had been established in 1952 by Theodore's father, a pharmaceutical entrepreneur who had made his fortune developing antibiotics in the aftermath of World War II. Over 7 decades, it had grown into a charitable empire that funded medical research, supported low-income housing, and provided scholarships for first-generation college students. The foundation's pharmaceutical patents alone were worth more than $200 million, with the remaining assets pushing the total value beyond $300 million. But according to every public record Maya could find, Theodore Blackwood III had no grandson named Marcus. Theodore's only son, Marcus Blackwood Sr., had died in a car accident in 1987. He'd never married, never had children. The Blackwood family line ended with Theodore, who had spent the last 37 years of his life turning his grief into philanthropy, ensuring that his family's wealth would continue helping others long after his death. The young man Maya had been serving for months wasn't Theodore's grandson. He was someone else entirely, someone who had inserted himself into an elderly man's life with surgical precision, earning trust and affection through months or perhaps years of careful manipulation. Maya's hands had shaken as she'd printed out page after page of public records, obituaries, and foundation documents. The scope of the deception was breathtaking in its audacity and heartbreaking in its cruelty. Someone had identified a lonely, wealthy old man and had crafted an elaborate fiction designed to steal not just his money, but his faith in family, his trust in love, his belief that he wasn't alone in the world. She tried calling Meridian, tried reaching Patricia Westbrook, tried contacting the restaurant's corporate offices. But Maya was nobody, a former waitress with no credentials, no connections, no authority to investigate financial crimes involving hundreds of millions of dollars. Every phone call had ended the same way: polite dismissal, careful legal language about not interfering with guest privacy, veiled threats about the consequences of harassment. By the 4th day, Maya had realized that traditional channels wouldn't work. The system was designed to protect people like Theodore Blackwood, but it was also designed to believe people like the fake Marcus, people who wore expensive suits and spoke with educated accents and knew how to navigate bureaucracy with confidence. Maya was an outsider, trying to penetrate a circle that had spent generations perfecting the art of exclusion. But Maya had one advantage that the criminals hadn't anticipated. She was still invisible. Patricia Westbrook had fired her for speaking up, but she hadn't taken steps to prevent Maya from speaking up elsewhere. The restaurant's security had escorted her out, but they couldn't escort her away from public sidewalks, public records, public phones. Maya began to understand that her 3 years of invisibility hadn't been a limitation. They'd been preparation.
She knew Theodore's habits, his preferences, his vulnerabilities. She'd observed the fake Marcus for months, had cataloged his mannerisms, his inconsistencies, his tells. She'd memorized the layout of Meridian, the schedules of its staff, the rhythms of its private dining rooms. Most importantly, she'd learned that the powerful were only powerful as long as people believed they were untouchable. Take away that belief, and they became as vulnerable as anyone. The plan that formed in Maya's mind was desperate, probably illegal, and almost certainly destined to fail. But it was also the only chance she had to prevent a crime that would rob not just Theodore Blackwood, but every person whose life had been touched by his foundation's work. Maya had spent her entire life being invisible. Now it was time to become unforgettable. The first injustice was silence itself. Maya discovered this on the 5th morning after her dismissal, when she called the San Francisco Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit and was transferred 4 times before reaching Detective Sarah Morrison, a woman whose voice carried the weight of too many cases in too little time. "Let me understand this correctly," Detective Morrison said, the sound of typing clicking in the background. "You're a former restaurant employee who believes you witnessed a forged signature during a private business meeting." "Not believes, I saw it," Maya insisted, pacing the narrow confines of her apartment. "Theodore Blackwood is being defrauded of $300 million by someone pretending to be his grandson. I have public records showing that his actual grandson died decades ago." The typing stopped. "Ma'am, these kinds of allegations require substantial evidence. Do you have documentation of this alleged fraud? Recordings, photographs?" "I have the public records showing—" "Public records don't constitute evidence of ongoing fraud. They show historical facts. What you're describing sounds like a civil matter between family members, possibly involving contested inheritance issues. The police don't typically intervene in family financial disputes unless there's clear evidence of criminal activity." Maya felt her frustration building like steam in a kettle. "But if you just investigated—" "Ma'am, I'm going to be frank with you. Wealthy families have complex financial arrangements that can appear unusual to outsiders. They also have teams of lawyers and accountants who handle these matters. If a crime were being committed, those professionals would be the first to identify it. I'd suggest that if you have genuine concerns about elder abuse or financial fraud, you contact Adult Protective Services or consult with an attorney." The call had ended with Maya staring at her phone, understanding for the first time how the system was designed to protect certain kinds of people while systematically dismissing others. Detective Morrison hadn't been malicious. She'd been practical, overwhelmed, working within constraints that made it nearly impossible to investigate crimes that required nuance and time. The second injustice came when Maya tried Adult Protective Services, where a caseworker named Jennifer Rodriguez listened patiently before explaining that they could only investigate reports of abuse or neglect involving vulnerable adults who were already in their system or who had been referred by medical professionals, family members, or other authorities. "Is Mr. Blackwood showing signs of cognitive impairment?" Jennifer asked. "No, he's mentally sharp. That's what makes this so insidious. The person defrauding him has spent months building a relationship, earning his trust. Theodore believes this man is his grandson because he wants to believe it. Unfortunately, loneliness and wishful thinking aren't grounds for APS intervention. If Mr. Blackwood is competent and making decisions voluntarily, even poor decisions, we don't have authority to intervene unless there's clear evidence of coercion, threats, or incapacitation." Maya hung up, feeling like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, where every logical step led to more nonsensical barriers. The system designed to protect vulnerable people couldn't protect someone whose vulnerability was emotional rather than cognitive, whose exploitation was psychological rather than physical. The third injustice arrived in the form of Patricia Westbrook's lawyer. Maya had been researching investigative journalists who specialized in financial crimes when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its politeness.
Miss Chen, this is Robert Carrington from Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. We represent Meridian Restaurant Group. I'm calling to discuss some concerning behavior that's been brought to our attention. Maya's blood turned to ice water. What behavior? We understand you've been making phone calls to various agencies and organizations, making unsubstantiated accusations about one of our valued guests. We also understand you've been researching private information about this guest's family. Ms. Chen, this behavior constitutes harassment and potentially defamation. It also violates the confidentiality agreement you signed when you began employment at Meridian. Maya didn't remember signing a confidentiality agreement, but then realized she'd probably signed dozens of documents during her hurried hiring process 3 years ago. I'm trying to prevent a crime. Miss Chen, I want to be very clear about your legal position. You are a former employee with no standing to investigate our guest's private business. You have no evidence of wrongdoing beyond your interpretation of a signature you glimpsed during a private meeting. Your continued interference in this matter could result in criminal charges for harassment, stalking, and defamation. It could also result in a civil lawsuit that would leave you financially liable for damages. The lawyer paused, letting the weight of his words settle. However, if you cease all contact with law enforcement, cease all research into our guest's private affairs, and sign an additional non-disclosure agreement, we are prepared to consider this matter closed. We're even willing to provide you with a positive employment reference for future positions. Maya understood she was being offered a choice between silence and destruction. The smart move, the safe move, would be to take the deal and walk away. She could find another job, rebuild her life, pretend she'd never seen that forged signature. In 6 months, the whole incident would feel like a bad dream. But as she sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by printouts of public records and foundation documents, Maya thought about her grandmother's stories of the Cultural Revolution. The old woman had watched neighbors denounce neighbors, had seen good people stay silent while evil flourished, and learned that the cost of safety was sometimes measured in other people's lives. "I need to think about it," Maya said. "You have 24 hours, Miss Chen. After that, our client will be forced to take more aggressive legal action." The fourth injustice came when Maya tried to contact Theodore Blackwood directly. She'd found his address through property records, a Pacific Heights mansion that had been in his family for 60 years, but when she'd arrived at the imposing iron gates, a security guard had politely but firmly turned her away. "Mr. Blackwood isn't accepting visitors today. Could you at least give him a message? Tell him Maya Chen from Meridian needs to speak to him about a family matter."
The security guard had made a phone call, spoken in low tones, then returned with a sympathetic expression. "I'm sorry, miss. Mr. Blackwood's personal assistant says he's not interested in speaking with former restaurant staff about family matters. She suggests that if you have business with the Blackwood Foundation, you contact their offices directly." Maya had tried the foundation offices, only to discover that the person answering the phone was Marcus himself, the fake Marcus, the one orchestrating the fraud. His voice had been smooth as silk and twice as slippery. "Maya, how nice to hear from you. I heard about the unfortunate incident at Meridian. Grandfather was quite distressed that you felt the need to make such a scene during what was already an emotional day for him. I was trying to protect him." From what exactly? From finally having family in his life? From securing his legacy through proper legal channels? Maya, I think perhaps the stress of losing your position has affected your judgment. Grandfather and I have been working with the Foundation's legal team for months to ensure a smooth transition. Everything is being handled by professionals. The conversation had continued for 20 minutes, with Marcus demonstrating an intimate knowledge of Foundation operations, Theodore's preferences, even family history that should have been impossible for an outsider to know. Either Maya was wrong about everything, or she was dealing with someone whose preparation and intelligence far exceeded anything she had imagined. The fifth injustice was the most devastating, discovering that the fraud had already been completed. 3 days after her phone call to Marcus, Maya had driven past Theodore's mansion again, this time seeing a for sale sign planted in the manicured lawn like a tombstone. The Pacific Heights property, worth at least $15 million, was already on the market. When she'd called the listing agent, posing as a potential buyer, she'd learned that the sale was being handled by the estate's representative due to the owner's recent decision to move to a smaller residence. Maya had felt sick to her stomach. The house sale meant the fraud was accelerating, that assets were being liquidated faster than anyone could track them. She'd imagined Theodore alone in some sterile assisted living facility, convinced that his loving grandson was managing his affairs while actually being robbed blind. But the sixth injustice was what finally broke Maya's paralysis. She'd discovered that Theodore wasn't alone. Through careful research into the Foundation's board of directors, Maya had identified 3 other elderly board members who had recently transferred significant personal assets to family members who helped manage their estates. Dr. Eleanor Vance, 82, had signed over her Napa Valley vineyard to a niece who had appeared in her life 6 months earlier. Harold Pemberton, 79, had transferred his rare book collection worth over $5 million to a grandnephew who specialized in literary acquisitions. The pattern was breathtaking in its scope and chilling in its implications. Someone was systematically targeting wealthy elderly people, inserting themselves into their lives as long-lost relatives, earning trust over months or years, then striking with surgical precision to drain assets before disappearing. Maya realized she wasn't looking at a single crime, but at an organized operation, possibly involving multiple criminals working in coordination. The fake Marcus wasn't just a con artist, he was part of something larger, something that had been operating successfully for years. The seventh injustice was realizing that she was the only person who could see the pattern. Law enforcement was overwhelmed and underfunded, unable to investigate complex financial crimes without clear evidence. Adult protective services could only react to reported abuse, not prevent sophisticated fraud. The victim's own lawyers and accountants were being systematically bypassed or, in some cases, possibly compromised. The financial institutions processing the transfers saw only properly executed legal documents signed by competent adults.
Maya understood with growing horror that the system's design, its emphasis on individual autonomy, its respect for privacy, its deference to professional credentials, was being weaponized against the very people it was supposed to protect. The criminals had found the perfect vulnerability: elderly wealth combined with social isolation, exploited by people who understood exactly how to navigate bureaucracy and manipulate emotions. The eighth injustice was the most personal. Maya's own family was beginning to doubt her. Her aunt, who owned the dim sum restaurant below Maya's apartment, had grown increasingly worried about her behavior. Maya had been spending 18 hours a day researching, making phone calls, printing documents, covering her walls with timelines and connection charts that looked like the work of someone losing touch with reality. "Aya, Maya," her aunt had said, using the Cantonese expression of frustration that had been Maya's soundtrack throughout childhood. "You're becoming obsessed with other people's business. These rich people, they have their own problems, their own lawyers. Why are you destroying your life for strangers?" Even Maya's mother, calling from the family restaurant in Chinatown, had expressed concern. "Find another job, daughter. This is not your fight. These wealthy families, they have resources to protect themselves. You're just a waitress. Nobody will listen to you, and you'll only hurt yourself trying." Maya had tried to explain about the pattern, about the multiple victims, about the hundreds of millions of dollars being stolen. But to her family, it sounded like conspiracy theories, like the desperate fantasies of someone who couldn't accept that she'd lost her job over a misunderstanding. The ninth injustice was discovering that time was running out faster than she'd realized. Through public records requests, Maya had learned that the Blackwood Foundation was scheduled to be dissolved within 60 days,
its assets distributed to a new charitable organization called the Heritage Trust, managed by Marcus Blackwood and a board of directors Maya couldn't identify. Once the dissolution was complete, recovering the stolen assets would become exponentially more difficult, if not impossible. Maya had also discovered that Dr. Vance's vineyard had already been sold to developers who planned to turn it into a luxury resort. Harold Pemberton's book collection had been quietly auctioned through a private dealer in New York, the proceeds deposited into accounts that led nowhere. The criminals weren't just stealing money, they were erasing history, destroying legacies, turning lifetimes of work into anonymous numbers in offshore accounts. Each day Maya delayed action was another day that evidence disappeared, that trails went cold, that victims lost not just their wealth, but their dignity and their faith in human decency. The 10th and final injustice was the realization that Maya had become dangerous to very dangerous people. 2 weeks after her confrontation with the lawyer, Maya had noticed changes in her daily life that sent ice through her veins. Her mail was arriving later than usual, sometimes with signs of having been opened and resealed. Her phone calls were occasionally interrupted by strange clicks and electronic noises. Most disturbingly, she'd begun to see the same faces in different locations. A man in a baseball cap who'd been in the coffee shop near her apartment had also been on her bus to the financial district, had also been walking behind her near the public library. Maya realized that her research had attracted attention from people with resources far beyond those of a single con artist. If the pattern she'd identified was real, if dozens or hundreds of millions of dollars were at stake, then the criminals behind it would have strong incentives to ensure that inconvenient witnesses remained silent. The choice was no longer between speaking up and staying safe. The choice was between fighting back and becoming another casualty of a system that protected predators better than it protected prey. Maya had spent 3 years being invisible. Now invisibility was no longer an option. It was time to become a weapon. The breaking point came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, when Maya's laptop screen illuminated a connection so obvious and so devastating that she wondered how she'd missed it for 2 weeks. The fake Marcus Blackwood wasn't working alone. He was working for Patricia Westbrook. Maya had been cross-referencing business licenses, corporate filings, and property records until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped. She'd consumed so much coffee that her hands shook even when she wasn't typing. But persistence had finally yielded the thread that, when pulled, began unraveling the entire conspiracy. Heritage Trust, the charitable organization set to receive the Blackwood Foundation's assets, shared a registered agent with MW Hospitality Consulting, Patricia Westbrook's private business. The connection was buried in layers of paperwork hidden behind shell companies and legal entities designed to obscure ownership. But it was there. Patricia had a financial stake in the dissolution of every foundation represented by Meridian's elderly clientele. The revelation hit Maya like ice water in her veins. Patricia hadn't fired her to protect a valued guest. She'd fired her to protect a criminal operation she was orchestrating from inside one of San Francisco's most exclusive restaurants. Maya's hands trembled as she printed out page after page of evidence. Meridian wasn't just a restaurant. It was a hunting ground. Patricia had spent 15 years building relationships with wealthy elderly clients, learning their habits, their vulnerabilities, their family situations. She knew who was lonely, who was isolated, who might be susceptible to the appearance of a caring relative. The fake Marcus wasn't Theodore's first family member. Maya discovered records of a niece who had appeared in Dr. Vance's life shortly after she'd begun dining regularly in Meridian's private rooms. Harold Pemberton's grand-nephew, had materialized 3 months after Harold had started hosting monthly literary salon dinners at the restaurant. Patricia's method was diabolically patient. She would observe her targets for months, sometimes years, learning their mannerisms, their stories, their deepest wishes. Then she would deploy carefully crafted actors, young, attractive, educated people who could convincingly portray the loving family members these lonely, elderly people desperately wanted to believe in. Maya realized that her own 3 years of invisibility had made her the perfect, unwitting intelligence gatherer. Every conversation she'd overheard, every signature she'd observed about the restaurant's wealthy clientele had potentially been feeding into Patricia's criminal enterprise. The scope of the fraud was staggering. Maya's research revealed at least 12 elderly victims over the past 5 years, with combined losses exceeding $800 million. The money hadn't just vanished, it had been systematically funneled through a network of shell companies, charitable foundations, and offshore accounts that would make recovery nearly impossible. But Maya had found something else in her research, a pattern of timing that revealed when the next strike would occur. According to the Foundation documents, Theodore Blackwood was scheduled to sign the final dissolution papers at 2 p.m. that afternoon in the same private dining room where Maya had first witnessed the forged signature. The ceremony was being presented as a celebration of his philanthropic legacy, with Marcus and several Foundation board members in attendance. Maya understood that this was her last chance. Once those papers were signed, once the assets were officially transferred, the criminals would disappear like smoke, leaving behind empty bank accounts and shattered lives. Theodore would spend his final years believing he'd been cared for by family, never knowing he'd been systematically robbed by strangers.
The decision crystallized with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. Maya couldn't stop the fraud through official channels. She'd tried every legitimate avenue and been blocked at every turn. But she could stop it by becoming something she'd never been before, the center of attention, at exactly the moment when her visibility would be most devastating to the criminals. Maya spent the morning preparing with the methodical care of a surgeon. She printed copies of every document she'd uncovered, organized them into folders labeled with each victim's name, each shell company's registration, each financial transfer. She wrote a detailed timeline of the fraud, cross-referenced with dates, locations, and supporting evidence. She created a media kit with contact information for investigative journalists, financial crime specialists, and law enforcement agencies. But Maya also prepared for the possibility that she wouldn't survive the day. She uploaded everything to secure cloud storage accounts, set up automated emails to be sent to journalists and prosecutors if she didn't log in within 24 hours, and wrote a detailed letter to her family explaining what she'd discovered and why she'd chosen to act alone. At 1:30 p.m., Maya walked through the front doors of Meridian for the first time in 3 weeks. The hostess, a young woman named Ashley, whom Maya had trained during her final months at the restaurant, looked up with surprise and growing alarm. "Maya, what are you doing here? Patricia said you were—" "I need to speak with Theodore Blackwood," Maya said, her voice carrying a calm authority that surprised even her. "It's urgent." "I can't let you go back there. You know I can't. Patricia will be arrested by the end of the day," Maya said quietly. "Ashley, I need you to trust me for the next 10 minutes. Mr. Blackwood is being defrauded by people he trusts, and I'm the only person who can prove it." Ashley's face went white. She glanced toward the back of the restaurant where Maya could hear the familiar sounds of a private celebration beginning, glasses clinking, subdued conversation, the rustle of expensive clothing and rustling paper. "I could lose my job," Ashley whispered. "You could lose more than that if you help criminals steal $300 million. The next 5 minutes passed like a dream sequence.
Ashley made a phone call, spoke in hushed tones, hung up with an expression of terrified determination. She led Maya through the restaurant's main dining room, past tables where senators and tech executives and foreign ambassadors conducted the business of power over plates of food that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The private dining room looked exactly as Maya remembered it. Mahogany table, Persian rug, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But the cast of characters had expanded. Theodore sat at the head of the table, looking frailer than Maya remembered, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. Marcus sat to his right, wearing another expensive suit and an expression of carefully controlled concern. But now Maya could see the others. Patricia Westbrook herself, dressed in a charcoal business suit and wearing an expression of absolute authority. A man Maya didn't recognize, introduced as the Heritage Trust's legal counsel. Dr. Eleanor Vance looking confused and somewhat lost. Harold Pemberton clutching a leather portfolio with the protective instinct of someone who'd already lost everything once. Maya realized she was looking at both the criminals and their victims, gathered together for a final performance that would complete the largest fraud in the restaurant's history. "Mr. Blackwood," Maya said, her voice cutting through the room's expensive silence like a blade through silk. "Before you sign those papers, I need you to look at something." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Patricia rose from her chair with the speed of a startled predator, her face cycling through surprise, recognition, and pure rage in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Miss Chen, you are trespassing on private property. I'm calling security immediately." "Please do. I'll open my folder and spread documents across the mahogany table like playing cards. I'd like them to witness this too."
Theodore looked up at Maya with the confused recognition of someone trying to place a half-remembered face. "You're the young lady from before, aren't you? The one who was concerned about signatures." "Yes, sir, and I'm still concerned." Maya pulled out a photograph, a copy of Theodore's real signature from a foundation document filed 6 months earlier, before his arthritis had worsened. "This is how you actually sign your name, Mr. Blackwood. Notice the distinctive T that curves backward, the B that never completely closes, the upward curve at the end of Blackwood." She placed a second photograph beside the first, the signature from the contract she'd seen 3 weeks earlier. "This is the signature that was already on the contract when you came to sign it. Someone had practiced your handwriting, but they got the details wrong. The T is too straight, the B is closed, the underline is flat." Theodore studied the photographs with the concentrated attention of a scholar examining ancient texts. The room had gone so quiet that Maya could hear the distant sounds of traffic from the street below, the whispered conversations of other diners, the rapid breathing of people whose carefully constructed lives were crumbling around them. "But that would mean—" Theodore began, his voice trailing off as the implications sank in. "It means Marcus isn't your grandson. Your grandson died in 1987. I have the death certificate here, along with newspaper articles from the accident. This man has been lying to you for months, earning your trust so he could steal everything you've worked for." The false Marcus had gone very still, his face cycling between expressions like a computer processing conflicting programs. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the warm familiarity Maya had heard in previous conversations. "This is insane. Grandfather, you know me. You know our history together. This woman is obviously disturbed." "What was your father's middle name?" Theodore interrupted, his pale blue eyes fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. The silence stretched for 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Maya watched Marcus's face as he realized that his careful preparation had missed this simple, devastating detail. "James," he said finally. Theodore's face crumpled like paper in a fire. "His middle name was Alexander, Marcus Alexander Blackwood. He was named after my father."
The old man's hands shook as he reached for the photographs Maya had spread across the table. "Who are you? Who are you really?" Maya watched the careful construction of months collapse in the space of a single question. But she also watched the Trisha Westbrook's face and saw something there that terrified her more than Marcus's exposed lies. The cold calculation of someone who had prepared for this contingency. "Theodore," Patricia said, her voice carrying the smooth authority that had commanded Meridian for 15 years. "I think you're having one of your episodes again. Remember what Dr. Harrison said about stress and confusion? Perhaps we should postpone today's ceremony until you're feeling more like yourself." "I'm not confused," Theodore said firmly. "I'm betrayed." But Maya could see Dr. Vance and Harold Pemberton exchanging glances, their faces showing the uncertainty of elderly people who had been conditioned to doubt their own perceptions. The criminals had chosen their victims carefully, people whose age made their testimony vulnerable to dismissal, whose isolation made their experiences difficult to verify. "Mr. Blackwood," Maya said, pulling out another folder. "Dr. Vance, when did your niece, Rebecca, first contact you?"
Eleanor Vance looked up with the startled expression of someone pulled from deep thought. "Rebecca? She found me through genealogy research, about 8 months ago." Maya placed a photograph in front of her, a professional headshot of a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes. "Is this Rebecca?" "Yes, that's her. She's been helping me manage the vineyard." Maya placed a second photograph beside the first. "This is the same woman, but her real name is Sarah Walsh. She's an actress from Los Angeles. She's also been posing as Marcus's cousin Jennifer, who's been helping Harold manage his book collection." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Maya watched 3 elderly faces process the information, saw the moment when trust transformed into comprehension, when love became grief, when family became fraud. Harold Pemberton's voice shook when he spoke. "Harold helped me catalog my first editions. She knew so much about literature, about my father's collection. She couldn't have been pretending all that knowledge." "She wasn't pretending the knowledge. She was pretending the relationship. Patricia provided her with detailed information about your interests, your history, your vulnerabilities. She spent months preparing to become the perfect niece, the ideal grandchild." Maya turned to face Patricia, who had been watching the revelations with the controlled stillness of a chess master whose strategy was being systematically dismantled. "You used Meridian as a hunting ground. You observed wealthy elderly clients for months or years, learning their stories, their loneliness, their deepest wishes for family connection. Then you deployed actors to fulfill those wishes while systematically draining their assets." Patricia's expression never changed, but Maya saw her hand move toward her purse with deliberate casualness. "Miss Chen, these are serious accusations that you're making without any legal authority or evidence. I think perhaps—" "I have evidence," Maya said, pulling out her final folder. "Corporate filings linking Heritage Trust to your consulting business, financial records showing payments to Sarah Walsh and her associates, email communications between shell companies you control, bank transfers that trace assets from the victims' accounts to offshore holdings registered to your network." The room erupted in voices. Theodore demanding answers, Dr. Vance weeping quietly, Harold Pemberton staring at the photographs with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. But Maya kept her eyes on Patricia, watching for the moment when politeness would be abandoned for survival instinct. That moment came when Patricia reached into her purse and pulled out not a weapon, but a phone. "Security to private dining room 3 immediately. We have a disturbance that requires immediate police intervention." Maya realized that Patricia was making one final play to have Maya arrested for trespassing and harassment before the evidence could be properly examined, to discredit her as a disturbed former employee whose accusations were the product of mental instability rather than criminal investigation. But Maya had prepared for this contingency too. "That's fine. she said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I've already provided copies of all this evidence to the FBI's Financial Crimes Task Force, to the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, and to investigative journalists at the Chronicle and the Examiner. Arresting me won't make the evidence disappear." Patricia's composure cracked for the first time, her professional mask slipping to reveal something much more dangerous underneath. "Miss Chen, these are serious accusations that you're making without any legal authority or evidence. I think perhaps I have evidence," Maya said, pulling out her final folder. "Corporate filings linking Heritage Trust to your consulting business, financial records showing payments to Sarah Walsh and her associates, email communications between shell companies you control, bank transfers that trace assets from the victims' accounts to offshore holdings registered to your network." The room erupted in voices. Theodore demanding answers, Dr. Vance weeping quietly, Harold Pemberton staring at the photographs with the expression of a man watching his world collapse.
The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of security, but Maya had achieved what she'd come to accomplish. The truth was out, the evidence was distributed, and the victims were no longer isolated in their confusion and shame. Theodore Blackwood rose from his chair with the careful dignity of a man who had lost everything but his integrity. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 8 decades, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You've saved not just my money, but my faith in the possibility that good people still exist in this world." As security guards entered the room, Maya felt a strange sense of peace. She had become visible at exactly the moment when visibility mattered most, had found her voice when silence would have enabled evil, had chosen truth over safety when the stakes were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars and human dignity. The battle wasn't over. Arrests would follow, trials would drag on for years, recovery of stolen assets would be complex and incomplete. But the fraud was exposed, the victims were aware, and the criminals could no longer operate in the shadows. Maya had spent 3 years learning to be invisible. It had taken her only 3 weeks to become unforgettable. 5 years later. Maya stood at the podium of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's San Francisco field office, addressing a room full of financial crimes investigators from across the Pacific Northwest. The conference room's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across faces that carried the wearied determination of people who spent their careers chasing money through digital labyrinths designed to obscure truth. Pattern recognition isn't just about seeing connections. It's about trusting your observations even when they challenge assumptions about how crime operates, who commits it, and where it happens. The slide displayed a map of the United States, dotted with red pins marking locations where elder fraud investigations have been initiated based on Maya's training protocols. Over 300 cases in 5 years, with combined stolen assets exceeding $4 billion. Each pin represented families who had been saved from financial devastation, elderly people who had been protected from betrayal, communities that had been spared the ripple effects of systematic fraud. Agent Liu, now promoted to Supervisory Special Agent, introduced the day's final case study. The Westbrook network was sophisticated enough to operate for 8 years without detection by traditional law enforcement methods. It was exposed not by technology or institutional oversight, but by an individual who understood that her unique position gave her unique responsibilities. Maya watched the faces in the audience as Agent Liu described the mechanics of Patricia's operation, the careful psychology of targeting isolated, wealthy elderly people, the patient cultivation of trust that preceded systematic theft. She saw recognition in some faces, skepticism in others, and the professional calculation of investigators trying to determine how similar patterns might be operating in their own jurisdictions. "Questions?" Agent Liu asked. A young investigator from Portland raised her hand. How do we train financial services employees to recognize these patterns without creating false alarms that could damage legitimate family relationships?
Maya had fielded this question dozens of times, and her answer had evolved through experience. The key is understanding that legitimate family relationships develop organically over time, with natural inconsistencies and emotional complexity. Fraud relationships are often too perfect. The family member who appears at exactly the right moment with exactly the right qualifications, who never argues or disagrees, who always supports financial decisions that benefit themselves. An older agent from Seattle leaned forward. What about the victims? How do we approach elderly people who might be experiencing this kind of manipulation without making them feel patronized or incompetent? Start with respect for their intelligence and their right to make their own decisions, Maya replied. Most of Patricia's victims were highly intelligent, successful people. They weren't deceived because they lacked cognitive ability. They were deceived because they were lonely and because the criminals were exceptionally skilled at exploiting emotional vulnerabilities. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from forensic accounting techniques to victim psychology to international asset recovery. Maya answered with the authority of someone who had lived inside a criminal operation, who had seen its effects on real people, who had learned that the most sophisticated frauds were often the most emotionally devastating. As the conference concluded, Maya was approached by Detective Sarah Morrison, the same officer who had dismissed her concerns during her first phone call 5 years earlier. Detective Morrison looked older now, her face carrying the lines that come from years of seeing the worst of human nature. But her expression held something Maya had never seen before: genuine respect. "Miss Chen," Detective Morrison said, extending her hand, "I owe you an apology. When you called me 5 years ago, I made assumptions about your credibility based on your job title rather than the quality of your observations. I've been following your work since then, and I wanted you to know that you've changed how our department handles elder fraud reports." Maya shook the detective's hand, feeling the weight of vindication, but also the sadness of knowing that her initial dismissal had cost precious time that might have saved additional victims. "We all make mistakes," Maya said. "The important thing is learning from them. We've implemented new protocols based on your recommendations. Every elder fraud report now gets a preliminary investigation regardless of the complainant's background or relationship to the victim. We've already identified 2 operations that might have gone undetected under our old procedures." Maya left the conference that afternoon feeling something she'd never experienced before: the weight of purpose fulfilled. The drive back to her new apartment in Oakland, larger now, with windows that let in actual sunlight, gave her time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. Patricia Westbrook had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The fake Marcus, whose real name was David Chen, no relation, received 12 years. Sarah Walsh and her network of accomplices had plea bargained for shorter sentences in exchange for testimony that helped recover nearly 60% of the stolen assets. Theodore Blackwood had lived to see his foundation restored and his faith in humanity partially rebuilt. He died peacefully 8 months later, surrounded by legitimate family members who'd emerged from decades of estrangement to reconnect with him. His final act had been establishing the Maya Chen Fellowship for Financial Crime Investigation, a scholarship program for first-generation college students pursuing careers in law enforcement. Maya pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment in the silence. Her grandmother had been right about being placed exactly where she needed to be. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not by those with the most power, but by those with the clearest vision and the courage to act on what they saw. The invisible had become unforgettable.